Right. So good afternoon again, and welcome everyone to our panel discussion on outlooks on Asian American individuality and stereotyping. This panel discussion is in recognition and celebration of National Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. And this is PHMC's most recent engagement in our panel series, hosted and sponsored by PHMC's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Governing Council. So we're so happy and excited to have such an esteemed panel group of panelists today. And I'm going to introduce our moderator who will then take over and introduce our panel and our panel discussion. But first, just a little bit about our moderator, Sophia Lee. Sophia is a partner and the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer Emeritus at Rorng, LLP. She's also a PHMC board member. Sophia has significant experience representing and advising a wide range of institutions, including nonprofit organizations, public and privately held companies, and government entities. Sophia also helps lead Rorng's service capabilities, advising clients on diversity, equity, inclusion, and as well as ESG, or environmental, social, and governance matters. Sophia is a frequent lecturer on matters concerning DEI, professional responsibility, and ethics in litigation and information management. She teaches diversity, equity, and inclusion in the legal professions as an adjunct professor of law at Temple University's Beasley School of Law. So we're excited to have her leading our discussion today. And I'm going to turn the Zoom stage over to Sophia. Sophia.
Thank you so much, Marlon. And thank you to the PHMC DEI Council for hosting this important discussion. We were first invited to participate in this program by the immediate past PHMC board chair, Michael Pearson, in early November 2020, over 7 months ago. A lot has happened since we received that invitation last fall, including the March 16 shootings in the greater Atlanta area where 8 people were killed, 6 of them women of Asian descent. The Pew Research Center just released their report in late April that 1/3 of Asian Americans fear threats, physical attacks, and most say violence against them is rising. Stop AAPI Hate, which has been reporting incidents of anti-Asian hate, released a national report in early May, just a couple of weeks ago, revealing that the number of anti-Asian hate incidents reported surged from just under 3,800 to just over 6,600 in March of this year alone. And last week, the nonprofit Leading Asian Americans to Unite for Change polled over 2,700 American adults across the country, and 42% of them could not name a famous Asian American. I will tell you the next most popular choices after I don't know were Jackie Chan at 11%, and Bruce Lee at 9%. What's important about these 2 individuals is that Jackie Chan is a Hong Kong actor and Bruce Lee died half a century ago. Asian Americans, based on this research, seem to remain largely invisible in America, and only recently has the media spotlight been shown on this community. So who are we? Asian Americans make up 23 million people in the US. We are a diverse group originating from more than 20 countries in East and Southeast Asia and the Indian subcontinent. We represent a variety of cultures, languages, ideologies, religions, experiences. The term Asian American was started in the late 1960s as a label of self-determination inspired by the civil rights movement that brought a renewed consciousness to communities of color and other diverse communities. And I might even say that we know someone from Philadelphia among our esteemed panelists who was a part of that movement to name and coin the term Asian American, our good friend Shiwen Law. And so speaking of history, let's go back another 100 plus years before the civil rights movement. Since the first Chinese arrived as laborers in the earlier part of the 19th century, xenophobia set in, prompting the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. This is the first law in the United States to ban immigration of an entire race of people. It's worth noting that the Page Act was passed 7 years prior, which effectively restricted the immigration of Chinese women. And by 1924, federal law prevented immigration from almost all of Asia entirely with the passage of the National Origins Act. And so I share this with you because this is the backdrop against which we're going to be talking about the Asian American experience and about the stereotypes that have pervaded since the beginning of Asian immigration to the country. There's that lovely stereotype of the yellow peril. Asian immigrants bring plague and disease and upheaval. The stereotype of the perpetual foreigner. Asian Americans are not seen or trusted as real Americans. And the model minority, which brands Asian Americans as rule-following, hardworking, high educational attainment, highly financially successful folks relative to other racial groups. And I say that because the stereotype, we believe, was coined during the Civil Rights Movement as a way of weaponizing Asian Americans against other communities of color, essentially asking the question, well, if Asian Americans can be successful, why? So I know I've just thrown a lot at you, a lot of facts and history. And before I introduce you to our esteemed panelists, I thought I'd bring it all together by showing you this music video. I know Marlon will play it for us, and after the video, I will be pleased to introduce our panelists who are actually here to provide commentary on the video.
In our wallets, they thinking we got commas. Really in back pockets, we carrying deep traumas. Hang tied us by our own trousers. Seen as outsiders, they used to redline us. Time caught us out whiting the white scholars. Drove a divide between us and the black brothers. You gotta admit it's dominant white college. Still, you ain't violent for most of them white collars. Southeast Asian dark cousins drive down the streets, police radio buzzing. Gaslighted to thinking we made progress. Still, they killed Christian Hall and said nothing. Not a model, not a monolith, ay, not a pawn for your politics. Nah, learn from Gandhi and Dr. King. If the system don't bring peace, we must abolish it. Yeah.
If you only knew, walk a mile in my shoes. If you only know, we're not so different from you. We're not invisible.
I'm sick of people believing that we got privilege and we're passing as white, when that's a myth fabricated to combat civil rights. Pit us against the black and brown, a means to divide and dehumanize. Like see them chinks, they doing fine. Just to justify the various slurs. Model minorities, not a portrait, it's an Asian caricature. So help us together as parody work. Before you call us wealthy, let's talk about our income disparity first. So I ain't claiming that we're white adjacent. The whiter races say ching chongs and the eyes of Asians. Bamboo stealing, blocking high positions, higher wages. They hired us centuries ago for only migrant labor. My God, they hate us from the Chinese Exclusion Act to the Hart-Celler Act. But they let us in to be pawns as part of the trap. Silence our issues like it's in the past. We ain't got no political power or media coverage. Where's the privilege in that, huh?
If you only knew, walk a mile in my shoes. If you only know, we're not so different from you. We're not invisible people.
Model minority. Got people ignoring me and my community. And just because some of us found success does not mean we do not know that we are being oppressed. See, some of us have been here for generations, others children of immigrants, and even others still immigrants themselves. We struggle with our own histories of American colonialism, yet we stand by our black brothers and sisters because we share the pain if we say your names. Vichar Ratanapakdi, Noel Quintana, Delana Hashayuan, Jiao Jitan, Dao Feng, and so many others. Rest in peace. This is not a privilege. This is not political. We are America, and we will never again be invisible. Never again be invisible.
We're not invisible people.
Thank you, Marlon. Thank you for allowing me to share that. I felt the need to integrate that into our conversation. When my 8-year-old first saw this video, she said to me, "Mommy, that isn't a rap song. That's a Declaration of Independence." And so thank you for allowing me to share that with all of you. It is now my honor and privilege to introduce our esteemed panelists who will speak to all of these issues and those that we've just heard in that song. I will introduce them briefly here because I think it's important that you hear their stories from them, their biographies, their lived experiences as we go through our Q&A. First, I'd like to introduce Nydia, award-winning news personality and journalist, Sunnaret Eang, Director of Wealth Management at WhartonHill Investment Advisors, Andy Toy, who I hope we will see on screen soon enough, a political activist, the Honorable Stella Tsai, Judge of the Philadelphia Court of Common Pleas, Narasimha Shenoy, an engineer and president of the Asian American Chamber of Commerce, and Sorn, Director of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs Language Access Services with DBHIDS. And so if you'll allow me to just kick off the conversation here, and maybe I'll start off with Judge Tsai. Judge, I'm particularly struck by these lyrics. Not a model, not a monolith, not a pawn for your politics. How have stereotypes about AAPIs, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, such as the model minority, impacted you and how you administer justice as a judge in the Philadelphia Court of Common Pleas?
Thank you for having us here to speak about these important issues. And if I may, I just want to tell you a little bit about myself to give context to what my comments will be. As you mentioned earlier, I am a judge of the Court of Common Pleas in Philadelphia. I was appointed by Governor Tom Wolf in 2016 and won re-election to the bench in 2017. I am the third of 3 state court judges in the entire Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So we have a lot to do. We need more of us. And I'm looking at you, Ms. Lee. In any event, I am a child of immigrants who, in the words of my mother, came to the United States to be free. And although you may know Taiwan is a home of bubble tea or a democratic entity with robust but unofficial trade relations with the United States, it might surprise some of you to know that Taiwan was started as a totalitarian regime that did not lift martial law until the early 1990s, excuse me. As some of you may have heard before, many, many times perhaps, and I apologize for that. My mother did have an older brother named Tetsu who was incarcerated by a nationalist regime and locked away for 18 years for violating the law of sedition, partially because he refused to name names. And one of the things that struck me when I told the story years ago is that I left something in narrative and that he had no opportunity for judicial review. And it's one of those things where we, at least in our systems, we have a political prisoner actually, well, we'd like not to have political prisoners, but we do have a right of judicial review. And he was one of the lucky ones. He wasn't executed. So when my parents had a chance to come to the United States, they were quite eager to do so. And my mom sponsored my Uncle Ted to come to the United States, and he became a citizen. And these are the reasons why, and he really cherished every moment he had as a free man. And we really do get choked up when I hear the national anthem. And I'm so proud to have that opportunity to represent our courts or be part of the court system and represent the community. But in direct response to your question, Sophia, that was probably a long way to get to it, about how it might affect us. I have to say, as we reflect on our history and heritage as Asian Americans and our relative careers in the law, the narrative around stereotypes gets really complicated. As Asian Americans, we are well aware of our mythological status as the so-called model minority, which I think some people want to buy into the hype because it serves certain advantages. But it is based on fuzzy math and has yielded negligible benefits in my belief at a huge cost. And in fact, recently, I learned from one of our fellow prosecutor friends that the recent home invasions of Asian Americans were perpetuated, or at least in part by, or at least the rationale for pursuing Asian Americans, why he profiled Asian Americans for invasion, was the perceptions that they were rich, that they would not fight back, and that they could not identify the perpetrators. So usually these stereotypes are being used against us, and I don't see what the advantage is. And it was developed at a time to help develop a wedge, I think, between communities, and it's not served us well. But in addition to that, just because of the way we look, even when our ancestors were born here came here decades ago, we are branded consciously or subconsciously as foreigners. And in my experience, I generally face relatively benign incidents of in the realm of racial profiling. I've been ni hao, ching chong, asked how long I lived here, told to go back home, those kind of things. But for the record, I was born in Harrisburg. But recent random attacks, like those documented that Ms. Lee reported on, things are getting worse and even life-threatening. I don't know what I face when I leave City Hall. I don't know what happens when I leave the courthouse. And I think there's a perspective shared by many of my colleagues, with or without masks. I think that we all are very traumatized about the recent events because we don't know where it's going to come from. And as lawyers and judges, our competency, even though we are so-called model minorities, our company's advocates and our English fluency are not rebuttable presumptions, but are things that must be proven time and time again. Ms. Lee and I have often joked about, because we have to joke, because otherwise we get upset about how much we often have to, when we go to new places where people don't know who we are, that we speak very loudly in our American accents so that people will take us seriously. And it's just not fair that we have to feel that we do that, but given the track record that we experienced as advocates and as now as a judge, I think that it's only fair to point out that, as others have noted, there's a question as to whether we are truly American, or at least entitled to be citizens, or at least entitled to be part of this community. Every time we go somewhere, we have to substantiate our right to live and work in the United States, and also demonstrate our loyalty to the United States time and time again. So I just would ask everybody to help us resist those forces who would find power in dehumanizing individuals just for their advantage, and seek, if those people would want to incarcerate us, persecute, or ostracize us just simply because of the way we look, in the name of some national security or some other rubric or rhetoric. And we just have to work together. Now, law enforcement is working with us to support us as we face these challenges. But we have to remember, it was not too long ago that they incarcerated whole classes of individuals, particularly Japanese, during World War II. That's the mid-20th century. It's in our lifetime. And certainly some of this, I don't know who all the audience is, but we have individuals here who probably were witness to segregation. These are things that are in our own history, and we have an obligation as citizens and as public officials to make sure we never return, that we are no longer invisible.
Thank you, Judge Tsai. Thank you so much for the reminder and the historical perspective that leads us to where we are, and how these stereotypes have come to and remain very alive. And so I'll direct this now to Rorng. You've shared with us, we've all known one another for so long. We've heard your very poignant personal history and story about arriving in America as a refugee. What have your perceptions been, your experience about these stereotypes relating to AAPIs? What about this perpetual foreigner stereotype? I'm sure you probably have a lot to say about this as well in your role as Director of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs and Language Access Services with the Department of Behavioral Health.
Well, thank Sophia. First of all, being perceived as model minority and the stereotype and the perpetual foreigners have hurt many Asian especially poor refugee and immigrant Asian in deeper despair. For example, Southeast Asian refugees who flee decades of wars, US bombing that destabilizing the nations in the regions that fall into the communists, lead to the genocide. Those are some of the issues that we not as a country, as a city, have not really taken into consideration and then treat us, I mean, in terms of the invisible wound for so long. So, you know, from the migration, the post-migration, we really encountered so many challenges from the initial resettlement, including the high rate, you know, in the area with already high crime rate, right? There's a high rate of poverty, post-traumatic stress disorder, and poor educational outcome are some of the issues that Southeast Asian are really facing. And that lead to youth growing up in impoverished neighborhood, failing school, and also lack of support and cultural and linguistically services. And that lead to some of them turning to gangs or to crime, like as a way to really support themselves or survival, right, in the community. Mind you, like we're refugees, our parents had no knowledge about the US, had no formal education, and really did not know how to support us in a new country, and they had to work hard day and night. And then the children who grew up in the neighborhood knew nothing better but, you know, to really assimilate or expose to this environment. And that's what led them into doing some of the get caught in the criminal justice system. So today, nearly 3 million Southeast Asians live in the United States, but at least 16,000 community members have received final orders of deportation. More than 13,000 of which are based on old criminal record. This is retroactive, right? If you get caught in the 90s when you were 16 or 20 and you have served your time and came out and become a productive citizen, regardless, you build a family, a community, you still can face deportation. And this is a situation and issue that had been impact us. And then the traumatic experience continue to affecting our community, right? So, and these folks to, you know, just to give you an idea that these young people, not even born in Cambodia, many are born in along the border or in a refugee camp and never set foot in the country, but being deported back to Cambodia, for example. So, you know, according to research, say that Southeast Asian refugees are 3 or 4 times more likely to be deported on the basis of an old criminal conviction compared to other immigrants. And that to me, it's due to, you know, the bias of criminal justice system and immigration system that discriminates against community of colors because, you know, as you know, many Southeast Asian are brown or black and poor, so we have become the target. For me, as a brown-skinned Cambodian refugee, I have been harassed in school, on my way to work or at work, being called or given names, all kinds of names, right? Because they don't, you know, really take consideration to really learn how to call my name. So I've been given all kinds of names because or being told to go back to where I came from so many times. And at work or in a professional setting, I'm often not taken seriously, right? So, you know, as an Asian woman who was raised to be humble and to avoid confrontation or conflict, it is an ongoing struggle for me to insert my voice, my ideas, and my vision. Whenever I have a chance to speak up, I was told to speak louder or to speak clearly or not to be emotional without taking into consideration that, you know, how it came up or brought. So when I have the courage to share, many times my idea or vision are taken without proper acknowledgement. proper acknowledgement. That's hurt, but what can I do? I just continue to do my best and live my life and work to build bridges and to work alongside with others to make this world a better place. In the last 30+ years working with immigrant and refugee community, I have experienced and seen the inequity of resources and services distribution. Grant or funding would go to well-established larger organizations, and oftentimes they would share very little with grassroots ethnic-based organizations to serve immigrant and refugee, and oftentimes take credit for that too, so that they gain more funding, and then just a perpetuating and cycle of exploitation and discrimination. Or oftentimes they would hire bilingual staff to represent and serve all immigrant and refugee community in the city. Or a very common practice that you may see often is that, these larger agency or organization would translate in material into another language, usually in Spanish, not thinking that there's over 80 different languages spoken in the city. If you're lucky enough, we may get top 5 languages and would count as equity. So that had been always my I just can't express how upset but I can't show as I normally trying to be more diplomatic. So what can we do differently? Well, this dialogue and more opportunity to learn from one another and build mutual trust, partnership with one another, with our stakeholders to ensure diversity, equity, and inclusion is in practice, not just on paper or slogan. And we all just want to be treated fairly with dignity, respect, feel included with opportunity to engage, serve, and share our skill, expertise, and experience so that we all can thrive, right? Thank you.
Thank you, Rorng. Thank you for your courage, your honesty, for sharing your lived experience with us. I can't help but think that your lived experience is so different, such a far cry from what people perceive to be is the model minority. Thank you. I want to maybe move across the screen to Sunny, because I know that your family has some shared history with Rorng in this, but also different in the sense that you're from here. Mm-hmm. I do that with air quotes. And yet, despite being raised here, from here, you've had some experiences in professional settings where you haven't felt like you were really from here, but instead treated like the other. Would you be willing to share those stories with us?
Yes, absolutely. First of all, thank you to PHMC and the DE&I Governing Council for putting this together. I think it's very timely. I think it's wonderful to be sitting here with the panelists. So thank you, and thank you for the individuals who have participated or are tuning into this discussion. So again, my name is Sunnaret Eang. I am an investment advisor, and I work for WhartonHill Investment Advisors. We're based out of Fort Washington, PA, but I spend my time here in Philly and South Jersey. So just a little bit about my background before I get into the question there. My story is somewhat juxtaposed to Rorng's story. So I'm a daughter to refugees. So my parents fled Cambodia in 1979 during the Khmer Rouge. So the mass incarcerations, genocide, communism regime. So they fled in 79 and they settled in a refugee camp in Thailand, which is where my eldest brother and sister were born. When my brother was born, he was the size of a Coke can, and we weren't sure if he was going to make it. So needless to say, he was malnourished and the conditions were horrible, to say the very least. My parents were eventually sponsored by a Lutheran church, and they settled here in West Philadelphia, which is where I was born. And they moved us to right across the bridge to South Jersey, to Pennsauken. And they put me and my siblings through Camden City Public Schools. So if you know anything about Camden, it's no walk in the park, right? So being born in Philadelphia, raised in Camden, was very difficult for someone who was a daughter to refugee parents, right? So they had very little money, didn't have any understanding or concept of the American way of living, didn't have a sense of community, didn't have any resources or friends. So they had to make ends meet and very much had this survivalist mentality. And that's kind of where I think I've gotten a lot of my grit and passion from. So my father had the ability to sew. So he started a tailoring business, and that's what he did his entire life to raise 6 kids. His brother, my uncle, did a very bold move, and he went to Hammond, New Jersey, which is the blueberry capital of the world. And at the time, and it still very much is still the case, it's owned by a majority of Italians. So you have this Cambodian refugee coming into Cambodia. He bought a plot of land and he owns a blueberry farm in Hammond, New Jersey. So, and that's how he raised his family. And he has since passed, but his son has taken over the farm. So that's my story. And that, that's kind of just a small percentage of what, I've experienced. And it was really tough to try to navigate, living in a refugee household or an immigrant household and trying to acclimate into a community where you're different from everyone else, right? So it was majority African-Americans, Latinos. I was bullied pretty badly for looking different, and my mom had to cook for us, right? So I would oftentimes go to school and her ingredients were very potent. So, I would have the smell of whatever ingredients she was using at the time, and I would get picked on for that. So I can laugh about it now, but back then it was just brutal for someone my age to have to experience. I didn't learn English until kindergarten. So, at home, my parents didn't speak any English. So the only English I could really pick up was TV, but that, we didn't really have much TV time. So given that backdrop and my backstory, I decided to go into finance. I studied economics in undergrad and pursued finance as a career. And specifically within finance, because it's very broad, I focused on wealth management. And for those who know anything about wealth management, it's a very homogeneous industry. So it's very white, very male dominated. The clientele is very homogeneous. So again, very white. And in my 12 years of working, I noticed that the clientele didn't really have many minorities, and they didn't have many women. So it's a very underrepresented part of the overall wealth management space. So I've spent a ton of time trying to make sure that I build a client base of individuals that look like me and individuals who could really benefit from the services that I can offer. Because, planning for retirement, planning for the next generation, making sure that you're sophisticated and smart about the way that you invest your money and the way that you have a nest egg for your next generation, things that, as the Asian community, we just don't think about. Because if I use my parents as an example, they were just trying to survive. They didn't have any money to invest, right? So I did that, but it wasn't the easiest path for me, because I worked at Brown Brothers Harriman, I worked at Merrill Lynch, I worked at Bank of New York Mellon, JP Morgan, very, very huge organizations. And oftentimes I was the only woman in the room, or in many cases, I was the only minority in the room. And I'll just share a quick story. And I think this does a really good job of answering your question, Sophia. A male colleague came up to me one day and he said, you as an Asian woman have the same exact resources, same exact opportunities that I do as a white man. And I said, you couldn't be more wrong. Like, that's absolutely wrong. And it turned into this back and forth, which eventually led to nowhere. Like it went nowhere. But that goes to show, you know, the world that we're living in today, unfortunately, and the view that people have of Asian Americans. Because if this person knew my story, he would know that we were not ever on a level playing field, that I started with a very different set of circumstances than he did. So I think that's interesting. And I think it's a story that I often share with people, just because, you know, that model minority myth really is a real thing. And it's going to take a lot of work and time to dispel that belief.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sonia, for sharing it. It's one of those things where we just don't spend enough time trying to be curious about one another, you know, to really learn what lies beneath the surface. I so appreciate your comment too about, you know, learning English from watching TV. That's how I learned English. And you know, I'm the first person in my family to go to college. And when I came home to tell my mom that I was majoring in English in college, she said, "Why? You already know how to speak it." And you know, it's just, you know, again, that disconnect that you were talking about, where there's just such a lack of experience of, you know, how things work here, and then trying to find your way. Thank you for sharing. So Nydia, let's bring the discussion to you and to more recent events and recent news. And, you know, obviously since the very tragic March 16 shooting deaths in the greater Atlanta area, you know, we're now seeing greater focus on the significant uptick in assaults, harassment, and sadly some deaths of Asian Americans over the last year. You saw this coming. You published an opinion piece in the Philadelphia Inquirer just a few weeks ago. The headline said, "Asian Americans saw this coming." Can you tell us what you meant by that? And you're on mute, Nydia.
You'd think after the number of Zooms that I've done in the past year and a half that I'd remember to turn my mic on. Thanks to PHMC also for having this today. So yeah, as we've been talking about, our history shows that time and time again, we're scapegoated for events that happen overseas. And racist stereotypes and false narratives lead to violence, anger, and discriminatory policy. So what is happening now truly comes as no surprise. And on top of that, many Asian Americans saw this very specific COVID-19 related hate coming. So back in February of 2020, I posted on social media and wrote my first op-ed for the Philadelphia Inquirer, basically begging people not to blame us for the coronavirus, because it was very clear that that was happening. At the time, you know, the headline was, "My father and I don't have the coronavirus. Please don't treat us like I do." Because I was already getting reports that Asian Americans were being shunned, looked at suspiciously, being told to wear masks even before the mask mandate. And again, this was all before the pandemic shutdown had even occurred. And Asian American friends and community members came to me and said, "Can you please amplify what's happening so that it doesn't escalate?" But as I say in that recent op-ed, you know, as is unfortunately often the case when Asian Americans speak, the rest of America fails to listen. And so here we are, you know, a year and a half later now, and we've got more than 6,000 hate incidents reported for that Stop AAPI hate resource. We've seen a huge surge in anti-Asian hate crimes being reported to police departments across the country. More than a 150% increase in major cities, a 200% increase in Philadelphia, and it is really traumatizing. I have interviewed so many victims. I interviewed a guy in Upper Darby who was punched in the face and attacked. His collarbone was broken. His jaw was fractured on both sides by someone who yelled at him, "Get the F out of here, coronavirus." Just a couple of weeks ago, I interviewed a 27-year-old Korean American woman who was attacked in Center City near the convention center, by a man who basically made a beeline for her after passing all these other people. And she believes that she was attacked because she's Asian American. She didn't go to work for 2 weeks. She didn't leave the house for 2 weeks. She's afraid to come into the city now. I mean, it is very traumatizing, and not just for the people who are assaulted, but I think for all of us, right? I mean, I tell the story about how on Easter Sunday, the day that that woman was attacked, it was a beautiful day. Our family had just finished a 1-week vacation. It was our son's birthday. We were celebrating the holiday. And, my phone started blowing up, and I immediately knew without even looking why. And it was because, yet again, there was an attack, an unprovoked assault on an Asian American. And so there's no question that we, A, saw this coming, and B, it's happening. And what is happening now is so deeply rooted in these anti-Asian sentiments that have been prevalent from the beginning of our time in this country. And so I think the silver lining, though, is that while our stories have for so long gone unnoticed, have not been acknowledged, have gone underreported, finally, we have the attention of the nation, and mainstream media and big companies and major brands are amplifying our stories, acknowledging our pain, and promising to do something about it. So I think if we can take this moment and really turn it into a sustained movement, I think we could actually make some progress and change the narrative. But one of the things that I keep harping on is that we can't do it alone. And so I have seen, increased activism by those within our community, but I've also seen a tremendous amount of allyship by people in all communities. And I think that's really what it's going to take. And I hope that that continues. And I've also been talking to Asian Americans that I think we need to now be more vocal than ever before in also supporting and standing behind those other communities as well. So that's sort of my perspective from the past year and a half or so, but it's been very troubling. But I do have hope that things will get better.
Yeah, thanks, Nydia. A question came up that, might be worth asking at this point before we move to Nick. A question came up in the Q&A about a critique of the phrase "Stop Asian Hate," and that somehow that phrase does not suggest that it's really about the systemic racism against Asian Americans, but that it makes the problem sound more like an individual's problem with being hateful. So there does not seem to be the suggestion of a systemic issue in that phraseology. And I wondered if any of you have a response to that.
May I take a crack, if I may?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you. I mean, it was a really good question, because I think part of it goes to what phraseology, what's our brand going to be? What's the brand of this attention on making sure that we stop these attacks on Asian Americans, and actually not for just now, but forever. And some individuals were trying to trot out the hashtag All Lives Matter or Asian Lives Matter. And part of that gets into that dialogue about undercutting sort of the workers, like sort of like putting us in different camps. And I think it was clear that we needed a different way to at least address this issue. And I think that was one of the reasons the tag came up. I'm not, obviously a person who helped generate that tag, but I think that it does, to me, at least from my perspective, it gets to the systemic racism issue because it's about a collective effort to stop this hate against Asian, whether it's systemic or individual. I think we all have a job to do. So I don't necessarily think that it's one or the other. I think that it does talk about individual responsibility. We do have individual responsibility. We have individual responsibility not to be biased ourselves, right? That's something else we need to recognize. So I think it's a kind of it's a collective, and I think to me it's an appropriate way to phrase what we're trying to do here.
I agree. And I think it's so important that we don't use the hashtag or the phrase or call our movement Asian Lives Matter, because I think it unnecessarily is sort of co-ops and distracts from the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think we've got to acknowledge and figure out a way to understand that we all have very unique struggles, and we shouldn't compare and contrast, but instead just work together to stop, racism and hate against all of our communities. But so I don't have an issue with Stop Asian Hate or Stop AAPI Hate as the names for this movement.
Thank you. All of this conversation about phraseology and branding, and as Nydia, you had mentioned, moving this conversation into a more mainstream space like business and corporate America. Nick, I'm hoping that you'll be able to help shed some light on all of this, given all of your contacts in the business community, given your international business experience. And hopefully you will give us some hope. What are your observations, and what does the future look like for Asian Americans and AAPI in this community and in the business community?
Yeah, thank you, Sophia. Sunnaret mentioned learning English. I've been here 50 years and I'm still learning, speaking and thinking in English, So I write down some notes in case off track. Our first generation immigrants are silent. You have noticed that. That's because most of them are here because of refugees, oppressed by the governments. And if they could speak out, they would have done back in their home countries. So we have to understand the first generation, they are not going to speak out, So it's up to the second generation now, and they are going to speak out, So we need to really encourage them to do this. Now, you mentioned the global incident. If you look at the global incidents, they do affect us, and our future. Just as the pandemic, which caused the hate crime, right? And the Japanese were in a concentration camp during the war. So all these things do affect us. We can expect increase every time there's a global incident, especially in Asia, we can expect retaliation back in here. I think we should really, as a Stop Asian Hate, is the first step for education. I think we should really educate the community to separate, the incidents. We are Americans, and we live in America. So everything happens in America affects us, Now, the myth is that we have the highest income. Yes, some part of this community do have highest income. They are IT guys, the doctors, and this. But there's the other side of the story, In Philadelphia, we have 25% Asians are in poverty. So, and people are not looking at that. They're just looking at, hey, look, these guys are making money, right? And most of them are come from India and China, IT and doctors and pharmacists, which understandable. But nobody pays attention to the lower section of our population. Now, Asians were included as a minority classification a few years ago. And there always been effort by the other minorities to remove us from the minority system for the business purpose. I remember Governor Casey, when he became a governor of Pennsylvania, first year what he did was took Indians out of the minority system. And they took Tom Ridge to put us back in the minority system, even though there was sufficient data that was available. It was one of the things the Asians don't deserve to be minorities, Well, we're, the model minority. In some respect, we are. If you look at our family values, a community togetherness, it is a model to other minorities. It should be, Now, my biggest, the Pew study indicated that the Asians own 10% of the businesses in Philadelphia, where the population is only about 6%. Now that is, people take this data saying that Asians do not need help. The reason that number is so is because the community itself help themselves. Look at the Korean Laundromat Association. They build up the businesses, family businesses. Look at the Indian Hotel Association. They're helping themselves. And if other communities does that, their numbers will also go up. Now, my biggest concern moving forward, I think the singer made that very clear. The conversation is going out of minority to black and brown. And this is a real concern to us because it is the divide and conquer story. That's how the Britishers won India. Putting one Indian against another. So I think we need to really work at once with finally, I do not see a reason why I should call myself as an Asian American. I am an American with Asian heritage. I think we should start looking at that term, Asian American. The Italians Americans don't do it. They say they're Americans. The German Americans don't do it. They're Americans, right? So why should we call ourselves Asian Americans? So we are Americans with Asian heritage. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you for sharing that perspective. And thank you for shedding light on this idea of this model minority. Just because that is the case for some members of our community does not mean that it applies to everyone in our community. And I think the other point that you bring up is just because this stereotype appears to be good, right? That these ideas are quote unquote, I just have to do air quotes, I apologize. They're still nonetheless stereotypes, right? They fail to delve deeper into the conversation beyond the surface or beyond whatever is politically expedient at the time. To your point about whether it's the model minority or the Black and brown community as being the only minority. Yes, there's a lot of weaponization, a lot of rhetoric that is being used to drive these wedges among these diverse communities, and I think your remarks have really pointed that out, Nick. We have a few minutes remaining, and what I wanted to do was just go around the screen and ask for your tips on what you share with our PHMC community about how we can advocate for, be allies for the AAPI community and for our communities of color. And in particular, one of our attendees wanted to know what elected officials to further this movement. And it may be a suggestion from others or other elected officials. I'm not necessarily suggesting that an elected official has
to respond to that. Good, because I would not want to be proposing legislation in my capacity as a judge right now. But can I speak to the issue about final observation? And this is a thought and that I embrace from the work of one Dr. Nydia. And it's something I've been saying to a lot of people because I really thought you pulled together in 60 seconds, Dr. Nydia. And it was the notion about joking about Asian Americans and oh, don't be, look, I remember from growing up being teased about being Asian and people think it's funny, but it's just a joke. It's not that harmful. It's just verbal. Why are you so sensitive kind of thing? And one of the things that I think that we need to remember though, is that those kind of jokes, which kind of, I just remember one of them right now and I'm feeling very, it's one of those things that goes to your gut about how, and I'll just say it's kind of silly, but it's me Chinese, me go Chinese, me go pee or Coke. And that thing. And it's so silly, but it's so hurtful. And it's also one of the things that helps perpetuate that foreigner status or foreigner stereotype that underlies all the violence, that the systemic violence, all the things that promote these attacks on individuals. It's seeing us as a group of dangerous people. And it's hilarious that we have this model minority stereotype because years ago in California, which is right now, I say a really great place, a lot of Asian American judges, a lot of representation there, but there was a case, People versus Hall, that we talk about a lot, where they refused to accept the testimony of an Asian American or Chinese person because we're mendacious. And it's in black and white. It's in black and white. We cannot be trusted. Our words cannot be trusted. Just imagine, that was only over 100 years ago. So I think it's important that people know, and I think one of the things I love what Nydia said, and I say to people, this is the face of an American, and get used to it, because I'm not going away. So anyway, so that's sort of my closing comment.
Well, and speaking of legislation, sorry, I was just posting and sharing on social media that President Biden is scheduled to sign the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act into law today. So that just crossed my phone. So just sharing that with all of you.
So that's one great example of how elected officials can help stop anti-Asian racism.
And I think one of the things that people can do if they want to show allyship and help our community is to be informed. I can't tell you how many times, especially earlier on, I would talk to people about what's happening in our community and they would express surprise and shock. And even though there had been stories written, even though we had done so many stories on the news, a lot of people did not know what was happening with our community. And I just think that if people could take the time to make sure that they talk to fellow Asian Americans, follow Asian Americans on social media who are amplifying these stories, take the time to read, the articles in their online newspaper, whatever it is. I think that's also really important because you have to understand what the problem is and understand the challenges of our communities before you can help. So that's one thing I think if people can just really take the time to be informed and to educate themselves, not just about what's happening now, but also about our history, and then share that information with others, I think that would be really helpful. I think it's important that we all kind of get out of our own bubbles and figure out a way to move in on a very grassroots level, in our own communities and schools and places of work.
Yeah, I think the hate is the systematic, I think we have enough legislation on the books, but what needs to be done is basically information, right? The reason we are in this situation is people giving misinformation or using information for wrong purpose. So I think we are broadcasting our real information and educating people is probably the only way we can reduce these hate crimes.
I know we're running short on time, but I actually have a quote that I'd like to share. It was shared with me last night on Malcolm X's birthday, and it was a quote from him actually. So, and I think it's very relevant to this discussion. And it says here, "Ignorance of each other is what has made unity impossible in the past. Therefore, we need enlightenment. We need more light about each other. Light creates understanding. Understanding creates love. Love creates patience. And patience creates unity. Once we have more knowledge about each other, we will stop condemning each other and a united front will be brought about." And I think that really applies here.
Rorng, closing words?
Well, just want to thank PHMC family for the opportunity, and all my fellow panelists and everyone who joining today. Again, this is, although it's always hard to talk about my experience, but it's always a great opportunity to talk and speak the truth and share the struggle that we have, and that hopefully we can continue to work together to really change the way we are and how we can better ourselves, better our community, and together we can thrive. So that's all I'm hoping for in our discussion, that we will take from each other and learn from one another and build partnership and really work to improve our society and system as a whole. So thank you.
Thank you. Let's all be the light. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you, PHMC. I will pass the mic to Marlon and Celeste to close out. Thank you.
I don't have, that's a following that I can't much follow. So, to all of you, Sophia and all of you esteemed, I am hardly short on words. In this instance, relevant words. The only thing that's relevant here, you all are thanking us and you're very gracious. We thank you. We sincerely thank you. I have some buzzwords that I've copied from all of you here. Someone recently, just a minute or so ago, said, be informed. That starts with being curious. So that's why we're here, because there's a curiosity. And I'll just say that we started some time ago around, this is not a moment for us. It is not at all. It is a movement, so that warms my heart. So on behalf of the DEI Council, I want to be respectful of everyone's time. We're losing people. We thank each and every one of you. I had the pleasure, Marlon and I, of being on the prep call last week. I got a one-on-one panel discussion in, as I shared then. So thank you one and all. So on behalf of the DI Council, you've been authentic, you've been gracious, resilient through not only today, but throughout your lives, and just coming here to share your experiences. And that's what these conversations are all about. So we appreciate you being here as part of our movement. We look forward to really dialoguing. For you, I made a contact with someone there to support some of our initiatives here. With that said, I want to announce to the PHMC family that on behalf of the Governance Council, we want to launch and invite you to form a resource group or an affinity group around these matters. So whether it's Asian American or Asians with American heritage, and that may be your first thing that you tackle, we invite you to please be in contact with me or with Marlon around forming this group. It only takes two. And I have a feeling that the folks around our esteemed panelists today will certainly welcome the opportunity to work with you all. So with that said, thank you all for being here with us this afternoon, and we will see you again. Thank you. So long, everyone. Thank you, Sophia, for being here and leading this. And thank you all for your vulnerabilities today. So long. Bye now.